So Imran, what is your opinion then when it comes to the range progression when we move from the different models and the changes physically that we've done to them? How does that affect the actual audio in your mind?
Yeah. So how those engineered differences and increased ambition manifest themselves in performance. The what's interesting is that the engineers at dCS, they have such a well-developed intuition on the ring DAC and the digital processing platform that they understand how they can extract just a little bit more, by making slight variations and improvements in different ways. And so oftentimes it's actually quite interesting, this iterative process of the engineers will execute an improvement in the design in one particular way, right? Naturally intuiting how that will impact in performance, and then it'll go to our listening panel, and they will evaluate and essentially put forth what it is that they're hearing, right? Changes, improvements, and so forth. And then that gets fed back to the engineers, and this just furthers this intuitive process. Now, as with all of that history and that developed knowledge, that we understand, going back to Andrew's point, that these different things that we can execute in the design that will make the biggest improvement, right? That will impact the performance the least amount, but allow us to be able to reduce out some of the cost. That's been really huge. So as you move up in the line, one thing that I think is quite interesting is that, yes, you would expect it's going to sound more refined, it's going to sound more organic, it's going to have better dynamics, better resolution, all those things. But one thing that I think is fascinating is that a lot of brands out there, as you move up in their range, right? As you move up in their range, the delta of performance starts to shrink as you get higher and higher. Right? So between maybe their base model and their next model, there's a significant delta of performance gap, right? And then going from their next model up to the next one, maybe that gap will shrink until you get towards the very top where, you might see a very small improvement. And that's what I think brings out that old adage of the law of diminishing returns, right? You reach a point where you're paying a lot of money to get just a little bit better. With dCS, we actually find that it's kind of the opposite. The difference in performance delta between our models is actually the largest, I would submit, between the top models. And so that's somewhat refreshing, I think, for a lot of folks when they get there. And sometimes, it can be, if you're, depending on where your budget is, that it's just like, oh my gosh, I can get a lot better.
Sometimes guys wish they hadn't heard what
Yeah,
they just heard.
exactly. But I think that there's no question that anytime dCS puts forth something as either a new, another model up in the range, or that we submit something in the form of an upgrade, like hardware upgrades like Apex or master clock upgrades, or if it's a software improvement, right? That if we're promising that there's a performance differential, it's a demonstrable gain, and you'll hear it immediately and distinctly, and it's both measured as well as subjective. Significant.
So one thing that I have found in like the higher end rooms, like this one we're in, is even if it's a small gain with a product, or what some people would say is a small gain,
Right.
it can be massive in a top end system because it's showing you what all is happening. And so it's like, oh, we only changed this one thing, but it changed the actual performance massively, and so anyway, that's interesting, and it's good to hear that as you go up the line, there's marketable improvements also, so a customer knows if he's moving from a Bartok to a Rossini, it's a worthwhile investment. He's not just getting like, oh well, it sounds a little better, It seems like what we have found in the store is that there's the house sound and that house sound with like the Lina beats most every DAC you hear, and then you start improving upon that, and as you go up, it's you're blown away every step you go with, wow, I did not know that this could get better than that. At every step, you think that to yourself, and it's been pretty awesome getting to experience it with customers and things, and letting them experience those changes, and we get to sit back and experience them ourselves, as the dealer, and it's a lot of fun going into people's houses and getting to AB, DACs for people, and getting to hear the change that they get from things, and when you find a product that is resonates with you and is exciting, it's fun to demo. It's fun for us to go into a customer's home and get them to get to hear this stuff. And I know that you guys live with that excitement as well, working for the company, but being on the other side of the coin, it's a lot of fun on our side too.
It really is. And the interesting thing is a lot of times it's level setting expectations as well. You brought up as an example the Lina. Right, the Lina is our most affordable network streaming, player, and its performance is just, it's unbelievable. It's a severe performance digital to analog converter network player, and the only thing unassuming, relatively speaking, to in our range about it is its lower price point. That is I would put the Lina Dac up against the any other alleged high performance digital to analog converter. Pull no punches. It is a severe performing digital to analog converter. And so a lot of times going in, somebody might be looking at a Lina and this unassuming, elegant little box, the size of a shoebox, and it has such severe performance. And so it's exciting. Yeah.
Andrew, so dCS has a few different clocks in the lineup. How does what's the role that the clocks actually play in the product and its performance?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because the importance of clocking is something that dCS holds very dear. But I think the idea of having an external master clock is something that's kind of quite widely misunderstood. So when you both encode, so analog to digital conversion, and decode from digital back to analog, timing is critically important. So basically you're taking snapshots of a continuously changing voltage. That's what you do with digital recording. The microphone feed is just a voltage changing over time, and the digital sampling is taking snapshots of that at regular intervals. So the clock assures the regularity of those intervals. It's like a metronome or a conductor's stick. And the points, and the only points at which that timing is critical, are the point of conversion to digital and the point of conversion from digital. And so we need to have a clock in the DAC, and we do. And the issue that you run into is the clock is based on a crystal that's made out of a material. Could be quartz, could be some other crystalline material. And each crystal has a resonant frequency, which is dependent on certain things. It's dependent on the material it's made from. It's dependent on the size of the crystal, which is affected by heat. As it expands, it changes size and it changes resonant frequency. And it's also very sensitive to interference from outside sources. One is vibration, because essentially that's the way it generates the voltage is by vibrating. It's sensitive to EMI, electromagnetic interference. It's sensitive to temperature changes, as for the aforementioned reason. And you have sources of all of this interference in the DAC. You have transformers that cause vibration. You have output devices that generate heat. You have FPGAs that generate electromagnetic interference. So the best place to have the clock, which is right next to the converter, is also the worst place to have the clock, and that's the trade-off that you run into. What DCS figured out is that there's a way to connect an external clock to the internal clock in the DAC in such a way that it acts like, and the easiest way to explain it is it's like a digital flywheel. So it's actually evening out short-term variations in the clock frequency, which are caused by these different sources of interference. So what the external master clock is doing in the DCS architecture is it's not bypassing, it's not replacing the clock in the DAC, which has to be there. It's putting a hand on the shoulder. It's kind of calming it down and smoothing out these short-term deviations caused by these sources of interference. And that became possible because we developed a way, our engineers developed a way of linking these two together in a way that the external clock is able to act as a flywheel for the internal one. And it's something called a phase lock loop, which is a chip that you can buy off the shelf, and many commercial DACs use off the shelf PLLs. We actually develop our own in software in a way that we can cause this linkage, this flywheel type linkage between them. And so what we're able to do with an external clock is we take, coincidentally, or ironically maybe, the exact same crystal, the exact same clock chip as you find in the DAC itself, and we're able to put it in an environment that is optimized just around the needs of that clock chip. It's not having to do all the other things that a DAC does. And so we're able to isolate it or decouple it from all these sources of interference, from EMI, from heat, sources of vibration, etc. So the way I describe it is like it's the same clock, but in the DAC it's sort of traveling in coach class, and in the master clock it's traveling in first class. It's the same passenger, just different environments. And the improved or the optimized environment in the master clock allows it to perform in a way that has much lower short-term deviation, which is called jitter. And the kind of the clever thing is how we connect the two, such that a clock with exactly the same accuracy is able to improve the stability performance of an identical clock in an inferior environment. So that's kind of the idea with the master clock. It's like a hand on the shoulder of the clock in the DAC.
So yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people I hear asked and they don't understand is a lot of companies will tote the idea that, oh, well, our clock is on the board with our DAC and that's where it's supposed to be. And and I found this out shortly after, becoming a dealer for DCS, is that you guys also do that, but then you have the external that acts as like a conductor, like you said. So I think it's a really good point that a lot of people don't realize is that the external clock is not just the clock, right? It's acting upon and with the other clock. And so anyway, thank you for that explanation. I think a lot of people don't realize
Jeff,
that.
if I may, it's another great example going back to what we said earlier about the choice and selection, the deliberate choice and selection of the very best componentry that we can possibly implement in any given design. And that's a great example of that. We don't cut corners on putting an inferior clock crystal inside of the DAC as a means of being able to peddle an external timing source that, we reserve the better one for this one. No, each one of them, they, in their own respective class, is the very best that we can put in that particular design. But the way in which it's implemented, by being in its own dedicated chassis with its own dedicated power supplies and so on and so forth, that it's able to provide that as a timing synchronization source to the internal clock, which is in a much more hostile environment. So that's where that benefit lies. And I mean, Yeah, long before it became more, I guess, in vogue to use external timing sources, dCS has been developing master clocks going back into the 90s when we were doing them for various signal converters that were all working together in large chains in distribution houses and in recording studios. That technology has been proven out, and we find it to be a benefit to this day.
All right, while we're on the topic of clocks, I've noticed that dCS obviously does one thing kind of unique that other companies don't do, and that is separate the clock inputs between like the 48 and the 44.1. Why?
Yeah, so the reason why is that we avoid messy math. Right? So when you're using something that is an alternative or any other alternative to a 44.1 base multiple and a 48K base multiple, right, you end up with what can be pretty messy math for audio sample rates. And we want to avoid that. Again, all in that obsession over reducing the maximum amount of jitter possible. And so by using audio clocks, separate audio clocks that are designated specifically for those base multiples. We cover all the audio base rates. So whether it's 2496, 96 is a multiple of 48. If it's 88.2, it's a multiple of 44.1 or 352.8. And so no matter what it is that we're listening to, we have an audio clock that can be referenced that is a direct multiple with even non-messy math. And that makes all the difference in terms of being able to have the maximum reduction in jitter, and that's what we're trying to do. And so we have those two different outputs that, depending upon what it is that the track that we're playing, right, that the internal clock can reference the appropriate clock receiving input from the external master word clock that is the correct multiple.
To change topics off of the clocking and stuff, but get into where the music comes from, like where our source is being produced. Do we need to use an external streamer with the dCS products? I know that they've got the internal capability. So will you speak on the external inputs versus using it as a streamer over the Ethernet connection?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that this is really it's really evolved, hasn't it? When you think about it, digital to analog converters, external digital to analog converters, were really something that was seen as kind of esoteric almost in the early days of digital audio. It was less common. Most folks, and the reason is pretty simple, right? Because back then, what was the primary source of digital audio?
Someone's laptop, or
well, even before that, right?
Right.
A disc,
yeah,
right? And
CD
in most
playback,
cases, that was pretty much everybody's sole digital source was a disc, and so they would oftentimes either have the digital to analog converter, which of course was co-located with perhaps their CD, so a CD player, or maybe it was an external DAC that was dedicated solely for the purpose of decoding 44.1 coming off of a Redbook disc transport, right? But then as digital audio has evolved and expanded, we have lots of other formats, right? So then we catapulted into DSD with super audio CD players, and then of course the really big breakthrough was when computer audio started to develop, and now you had asynchronous audio sources that were coming from online sources, right? And they could be in multiple different lots of different sample rates, and so I think at that particular time we started to see that there was more within that holistic approach that we took that we could control and elevate the performance to. And so we started building out our digital to analog converters to include high performance streaming network sections that were co-located within. And certainly that's the case with the Lina up through the Rossini range. And then from there, as we move into the Vivaldi and the Varese, we take kind of a separate philosophy where, of course, we can engage even more performance with chassis or dedicated processes that are specific to that. But having the streaming co-located with the digital to analog converter, there's a lot of sensible reasons for doing so. We can optimize the performance of that to the circuitry that's within, and we can provide a lot more compelling value to the end user by having a high performance a streaming section built within that's designed specifically to exploit the best performance out of the DAC.
Okay. When it comes to the different formats, like Andrew, with PCM, I mean, do you feel like PCM is still evolving, or have we hit a cap where, the 32-bit, or 24-bit or whatever, are we at as high as really we need to be, or we're going to be?
Where's your crystal ball?
Yeah.
Do you see an evolution here in PCM?
Yeah. No, I think there's good arguments to be made that we are where we need to be. I think even 24192 is capable of giving us exceptionally high sound quality. The limitations are not on the digital side. I remember the launch of the CD and the marketing slogan "Perfect Sound Forever." And I remember hearing the first CD players in stores and thinking, that's far from perfect. Mm-hmm. It took me a long while before I dipped into digital. And I think there's a sort of inherent misunderstanding there. Nyquist proved that it's possible to perfectly represent any sine wave at any frequency, as long as you sample it at least double the frequency of the sine wave you're trying to sample, and that's mathematically proven. So in that sense, in the theoretical sense, digital is perfect. What's not perfect, and is still not perfect, are the actual implementations, the real world implementations of that theory. And so I think the boundaries that dCS and other companies out there are pushing back with each generation of our technology is in the implementation of those digital principles, not in the digital principles themselves. And I think that there's more work that we can do in the real world implementations of the current codecs that don't require us to go to a greater bit depth or a higher sampling frequency. So yeah, my personal take for firstly, PCM hasn't really evolved for quite a long time. We've had the formats that we have today for quite a long time. We've had DSD for quite a long time. The formats are theoretically a lot more perfect than our ability to implement them in the real world. So personally, I think that the progress is going to be made on improving the circuits that we design to implement these principles rather than in the principles themselves.
Yeah, and me and you off camera were briefly discussing the concept that all of this equipment isn't to add something to the sound, it's to keep from losing what is there. And but to keep from manipulating it or from losing it is difficult. And and so when we've already got a source that is playing beyond our ability to hear, then it becomes, like you were saying, it becomes how can we implement the hardware in a manner that we don't modify this as it comes through this, or this conversion.
Anecdotally, if I can add to that,
yeah.
Jeff, one of the most exciting things that we've been able to witness as Andrew and I and my colleagues have gone out and demonstrated our latest product ranges, things like the DAC X or certainly with the Varese, is that when we're playing back music, not in many cases high-res forms of music, but just standard Redbook CD, and listening to what has been there the whole time, right? But that we've just never been able to fully capitalize on. That is, I think, speaks to kind of what Andrew's point is, which is that in many cases it's not necessarily that we could choose to be chasing, higher bit depths or greater sampling rates and so forth. And yeah, maybe there's some performance to be had there. Maybe there's not. But the point, what we found is that there is so much at the heart of what we have in the form of existing bit depth and sample rates, that where we're running, where the risk of running, askew is in the playback and in the proper decoding of that existing bit depth and sample rate that we already have. There's so much work that can be done there to continuously exploit more and more performance. So yeah, the accuracy at any bit depth or sample rate is what we're after.
So now that we've covered some PCM, what about DSD? We mentioned sampling. How many times can you sample something? Well, that's kind of the foundation of DSD, right? So, but, DSD with SACD kind of having died out, and now DSD has kind of become a download format kind of thing, but it's still very niche. Does DSD still have a place, and is it still evolving?
I think so. I think that one of the things that's interesting about that, right, is that compared to, I think, some other manufacturers out there which have chosen to nominate their dog in one fight or the other, dCS has great history in development on both sides, both on the PCM side as well as on the DSD side. I mean, we were on the working group for DSD, and we provided the encoding technology that made it possible for Sony Philips to be able to encode that DSD encrypted file on a disk, right? So when you go into a dCS product, you have the ability to choose between PCM and upsampling of DSD, and so I think that where there's an opportunity for us to be able to continue to strive for better and more accurate reproduction, we're going to do everything that we can to use our technology to be able to exploit that performance. And what's great about the Ring DAC, and because we control every aspect of its design and architecture from stem to stern, so to speak, on both the hardware as well as the software side, it allows us the flexibility, more so than I think just about anybody else out there, to be able to make our design decisions that will enable the best optimized performance out of either, and we don't have to choose one over the other. So yeah, I think that's as best I can do without a crystal ball.
Yeah.